Hello, welcome to the audio lecture on painting. With this lesson, we're going to be looking at painting from a variety of angles. And the first one we're going to look at is how we actually look at a painting. Most of the artwork in this lesson asks you to really stop and consider, to think deeply, to look deeply. And that's something that can be really hard to do in our busy lives. This portrait that we're looking at here is an oil portrait of the artist Gustave Courbet, and he's considered to be the father of the Impressionists. He was active before the Impressionist period, but he also got into some political trouble because he demonstrated against the French government. So he was someone who began to break away from the strict realism of what we call the academic period and began to loosen and simplify his strokes. And you can see in his choice for this self-portrait as a young man, he was probably someone who was rather creative and perhaps rather fiery. When we consider painting this as a self-portrait, it's something that takes courage, and it's really quite a beautiful expression. Notice how he has painted the light and shadow on his face and on his hands. Let's begin by going through some media, some of the different ways that people paint paintings. These are two images that are painted by two artists that were active right before the Renaissance, a few hundred years. On the left is one by Cimabue, which is seen as a great example of the beginning of relaxation of form that happened with the Renaissance. And on the right is one by Giotto, painted really not much later, and artists and art historians often look at the difference, the way that the one on the right is so much more natural. What we're going to also look at here is how they did it. This is painted with egg tempera. Egg tempera is actually the process of taking an egg yolk, an actual egg yolk, and mixing pigment with it in order to create a painting. Now these are painted with that style. Often egg tempera has a more muted style, but it also can be quite beautiful. And I invite you to look at the video in this week's lesson that compares egg tempera with oil painting. There's also a video of the great artist Andrew Wyeth, who was one of the best egg tempera painters surely of the 20th century. So now we'll move on to the art of fresco. Fresco is fascinating because what they're actually doing is painting into wet plaster. Now what the artists are doing on the right is creating what they call a cartoon, or a way to stencil onto a work of art. On the left is an image, is one of the more famous fresco paintings of all time. Although the media fresco was used throughout Mesoamerica, South America, and Europe for really for thousands of years. In this case, we're looking at a scene from the Sistine Chapel by Michelangelo. Let's move on and look at oil painting. Now, oil painting is an interesting media. This one also would cover a couple of other topics in our lesson. You could call it a surrealist painting. You could call it an expressionist painting. And there's even an aspect of it that is super realism. But in this case, we're going to talk about it as an oil painting. So oil paint is basically pigment mixed with oil, linseed oil, walnut oil, sesame oil, or something like that, and often a kind of a binder to make it a little bit stiffer. Traditionally, these were stones and earth that were ground with a mortar and pestle. But along about the time of the Renaissance, oil painting was really revolutionized when they began to figure out how to put paint in tubes. And this allowed artists to go outside, to travel, to be a lot more mobile with their painting. In this work, I feel like the artist is really celebrating color and is taking some liberties with color, which makes it actually all the more interesting as a work of art. I want you to notice the blues and the greens, and then the bright pinks and yellows that are on the actual figure, and how the blue of the eyes makes them really jump out at you. None of this is accidental. Now let's look at an older oil painting, which is called the Madonna with the Long Neck. And this one's in our text, and I wanted to include it because it's just so odd. It actually has characteristics of what we call mannerism. And this was something that came into prominence at the end of the Renaissance. Look how it sort of has a frame within a frame here, you see? And what in the world is this guy doing down here? It's sort of staged. The paintings are sort of staged. Many scholars believe that this is an unfinished work, especially when you look at the baby, which to me looks like kind of a sick baby, an unfinished baby, or maybe that's just what the artist was doing. I guess on some level we may never know. Well, moving on to watercolor. Watercolor is so much fun to play with because there is an element of losing control. Here it looks like on the right it's gone completely out of control, but I would venture that this was pretty carefully planned. One of the beautiful things about watercolor is its translucent and watery nature, which makes it have this fluid quality. In our text it says that watercolor is a medium where we don't often get detail. I want to share with you this artist that's a friend of mine. His name is William McNamara, and he paints images of the Buffalo River region in watercolor. He does large-scale watercolor paintings that have an incredible level of detail. So this is just to show you that each medium can be used by the artist in such a variety of forms, and there's really no rules that dictate how it needs to be used. Let's move on to acrylic. Here we're getting into abstraction. Now, acrylic paint does not only have to be used for abstraction, and in the book, when they talk about it has a plastic quality, I would say that they've really improved the quality of acrylic paints so that some of them are very similar to oils. I work with a slow-drying acrylic paint, and I love it. The acrylic paint is fun because you can just really take it with you anywhere, and it can be used quite easily. It doesn't have fumes, all that. This painting is just beautiful as an abstraction. Notice how the red jumps out at you. What would this painting be if it didn't have that fuchsia red aspect? Notice how the eye in this case is really drawn towards the center of the painting, which we generally discourage. Usually the eye maybe will be drawn a little bit off center to create interest. But here there's a quality of this painting that keeps my eye dancing around. And I wonder if the artist might have done it with a palette knife, which is a tool typically used to mix paints, but artists very often use it to smear paint on the surface of a canvas. Moving on, let's consider brush painting, traditional Japanese and Chinese painting. There is a historic example in the textbook, and I'll ask you to take a look at that. This one I've included because it demonstrates one of the most notable qualities to this medium. Notice how these brush strokes are so confident. The artist is not wondering whether or not to put the shadow here or there. They're just making one firm stroke to really tell us about the form. That's a sign of a master brush painter. And when you look at the Zen paintings or Sumi paintings, what you see is maybe 4 brush strokes, but they're all perfect. That would be the hand and the brush and the heart and the mind all working together to create great art. There's an aspect of that that I saw in this painting also. I want to visit this one because it's in our textbook and it's such a crazy painting. It's a mixed media. So this is by the great artist Botticelli. He worked primarily in egg tempera. And you can see in looking at his work some of the real qualities of egg tempera painting. This one is actually egg tempera with oil on top. So he's used the oil paint to draw out what is under the kind of more dull quality of the egg tempera and make it more luminous. This is a interesting painting in its own right, because it's Venus and Mars, and they typically are at battle, but now they've found a way to reconcile, and there's the mischievous sort of cupids or satyrs, they look like satyrs in the background, that are really messing with things. What I think is quite interesting is that the one on the left by Venus has the helmet of Mars on, and the other one is about to blow a horn on the right into Mars's ear. And if you look closely in the right corner, where Mars is resting his arm in what one might call the afterglow, there's a satyr that is playing inside of his armor. So he's basically completely disarmed by the power of love. That's something to consider, isn't it? Now, in our lesson, they go through several elements of painting: composition, shape, space, and form. It's very concise, and the material is presented in a way that is really useful, that I want you all to look at. I want to talk about one aspect of line that I find quite interesting, and for those of you that are artists or that are interested in the arts, it's worth looking at. That would be the quality of lost and found line. When a line is not completed, our mind and our eye will still complete it. Look at all the holes here, but don't we see that it's flowers? And again, this one is a drawing, but I wanted to show you. There's something quite beautiful about having a line appear and disappear, and what that does to the artwork. It's always something to keep in mind when one makes a work of art. The discussion question this week covers several of the styles of painting of the last 150 years. I've asked you to pick one and to find an example and tell us why you picked it. You can pick it because it bothers you, because it's odd, because it really draws you in, or because you simply love it. I want you to choose that and then tell us why. And then you get to look at the other choices, and hopefully we will cover all of these styles in the discussion. I'm going to run through them here. First off, let's look at Impressionism. Impressionism was actually started, well, the story is kind of interesting. When they built the Eiffel Tower and they made all the large streets in Paris in the just the late 1800s, 1860, 1870, then there was a lot of sidewalk cafes, which allowed artists to gather and talk about art. At the time, art had many strict rules around it, if you can imagine, in what was called the academic system. So these artists, they started to drink wine and talk, or have coffee and talk, or tea. And they decided they were going to change, that they could change the way that they made art. So they moved away from this strict realism, and they moved into looser painting styles. As I said earlier, the fact that paint was now in tubes allowed these artists to paint outside. Also, they were very focused on qualities of light. They would return to the same spot at different times of day to paint it over and over again. And instead of hiding their brushstrokes, as the academic painters were prone to do, these artists celebrated that paint was paint. As I said in the text this week, what is a painting? A painting is a bunch of paint gooped onto a surface. A painting is never ever going to be a body of water with a distant tower. No, it's just a piece of cloth. So these artists really celebrated that, and that would be in the Impressionist period. Monet is a well-known Impressionist painter. Now, as in any good school of art, they rebelled, they had their own shows, they became quite popular as rebels, and then they kind of made their own club. Now, when this was it's just about 25, 30 artists over a relatively short period of time, give or take 10 years. But then a lot of new, younger artists came along, and they kind of bucked the trend and didn't really follow the guidelines of the Impressionists. So that offended the Impressionists, and these guys are called post-Impressionists. This is a painting by Cezanne, and it's another version of a mountain that's presented in our textbook and talked about quite a bit in our lesson. Here he has used the lost and found line also. The next kind of art that we're going to talk about is Expressionism. Expressionism, that one's easy to remember because we express emotions. Expressionist art is very emotional art. Here we have one of the most famous Expressionist pieces, although it was actually created before the term was coined. It's Edvard Munch, The Scream. He painted 5 of these, and they were all about him walking along. It's a cold night. He's been ill. His sister is dying of tuberculosis. The world is not good in his mind, and he's overcome with this feeling. So he goes home and he paints this painting. Now consider, has anyone listening ever felt like that? I have. So what he did with this work of art is he was able to tap into that universal angst, really, the suffering that people all have at one time or another. And by relating to this, maybe people feel they're not alone. So it's become a very popular image. Here's another example of Expressionist art, which is just simply something that I found on the web. And it's Expressionist because it's got a lot of feeling to it, and it looks like it was very freeing for the artist to paint. In our lesson this week, there's a section on color, and I would prefer that you read it so that I don't make you listen to a hour-long lecture and talk about everything that I know and love about color. However, here, look, I want you to notice this. A rule about color is that warm colors come toward the viewer and cool colors go away. What would be a warm color? Well, that's easy. What's fire? Oranges and reds. They're warmer than blues and greens. So as we see here, the oranges and the reds are advancing towards the viewer. And that would be a good choice for the artist to put that on the nose, the part that's coming toward the viewer. Notice how the shadow side, or we can imagine it as a shadow, is in the blues and the greens, and somehow goes away a little bit. Okay, there you go. There's a fact about color. Cubism. Cubism is cool. I mean, I used to think Cubism is wacko, but now I think Cubism is cool because I understand it more. What if you were able to look at something from a variety of perspectives at once and then paint it? Well, that's Cubism. So it was actually started by Picasso and another man named Braque. And the early paintings look rather haphazard. They weren't. Picasso toiled over this. His early Cubist paintings, even though they look kind of like they were just thrown together. And this is by another artist, actually, who I cannot name. I am choosing it because I find it quite evocative. And you can see how it's as if the world is fractioning, is getting into all these different facets as a gem might. In fact, when the first Cubist paintings were presented, the critics said that they looked like a field of broken glass. I want to take a moment and look at Dadaism, because people always look at that and think, what in the world? They're so offensive. If you look at Dada works, they're very offensive, often. But here's why. These guys, they were pretty much all men, they were active just after World War I. So think about it. They're living in Europe. World War I was an incredibly devastating war, with the first use of poison gas, with the trenches, with cities being just completely destroyed, and just millions of innocent people killed. And this was followed by the influenza epidemic, which again killed millions. So these artists came out of that time. They looked at the art establishment and they said, you guys are just really, your ideas, they don't matter to me, because they were really traumatized by war. So they made all this art to kind of thumb their nose at the establishment. Here's a very famous Dadaist piece where this is actually collage, but you can see how the artist is just poking fun at the laws, all of the laws that have to do with art. I mean, he's got a shoe on his forehead, for goodness sake. Moving on, let's look at surrealism. Surrealism means art of the unconscious. And that is a place where I often encourage my students to go, to do things that are just out there, that just don't really make sense, but that are exercising their imaginations. Ideally, the exercising of the imagination comes from inside, not from looking on Pinterest, or maybe we look to get ideas, but then to take it to a whole new place that is uniquely that of the artist. Here's two surrealist ones. They'll happen to have the same feature. They're by different artists, but really surrealism can be about any subject. It does not have to be about towers on the back of beasts of burden. I just found these and I thought they were kind of interesting. Let's look at pop art. And in ways, pop art relates to Dadaism because it's poking fun at society. Pop art was more active, came into its own in the 60s when advertising was everywhere. And you think after the 50s, the brand new, when TV dinners were all the rage, when technology was going to just change everything and be the answer, then artists like Andy Warhol, whose work we see here, sought to make fun of that. Now, he started off in advertising, and then he went on to create his work. Here we have abstract expressionism, again a painting by Rothko. Maybe you don't relate to Rothko. Some people do, some people don't. When I stand in front of a Rothko, I really get it. I really understand what this artist is trying to say by really not saying very much. And lastly, let's look at realism. This artist is actually called painting, but he's using pastel. So it's called pastel painting, and it's what we would call hyperrealism. Hyperrealism is possible really because of photography. But in this case, the artist has to go deeply into what they're actually seeing in the reference and recreate it as accurately as possible. And as you can see here, it can be quite powerful. The one more thing that I want to talk about, because I feel like I'm doing any of you a favor, is picture frames. They touch on it in the textbook near the end of the chapter. They talk about how some artists use frames as an integral part of their art. And I just felt like showing you these couple of examples, which I actually think are very bad examples of picture framing. And I can already hear some of you saying, hey, but the one on the right is cool. Okay, it's kind of interesting, but here's the question. When you look at the picture on the right, what do you notice first? Do you notice the picture, or do you notice the picture frame? That is the essence of the problem. If any time you notice the matte of a picture or the frame of the picture more than you notice the picture, the framing has failed. And I'm telling you that because I can see you going into the local craft or hobby store, picking out a frame, and consider the most successful frame is the one that makes the artwork stand out. So that's my take on picture framing. And lastly, I just think this is such an endearing photograph, and I wonder what this artist's work looks like. Here we have all of he's an oil painter, he or she. Somehow I think it's a male. And look in the background. There's the electric guitar, kind of the stuff all over the floor, the computer, and this perfectly clean workspace, waiting for the next painting to be painted. For me, I find that both looking at art and painting art, creating art, takes me to a place that really nothing else does. And as we consider all of the great technology that's available today, that's really so useful, smartphones and the internet and everything that we have in the media to take us away from direct action and response. My feeling is that it's important to use these technologies wisely, but to remain open to that unique and really beneficial experience of complete focus that happens when we are absorbed in a work of art or when in the creative process. And the result really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's a masterpiece or if it's not anything you'd want to show to anyone. What matters is getting into that place, is going through the challenge that's inherent in the painting process and working with that and within that. So on that note, all I can say is thanks for listening.